Everyone has one of these, and everyone will have one of these. But it's this little dash in the middle that truly defines our lives.
There was no one on this planet like our dad. And I believe that in his time on this earth, he accomplished everything God intended him to accomplish. And I wholeheartedly believe that he is in heaven now, looking down on all of us, and he's smiling.
A lot of people have told me lately what a great teacher and coach Dad was. One of the greatest lessons that he ever taught me was prioritizing your relationships. And it was very, very important to him that God comes first, and then your spouse, and then your children after that. Mom and Dad were a shining example of why and how that works in their 63 years of marriage.
The hardest thing a person has to do in their life is to get their relationships prioritized. The most important relationship you'll ever have is with Christ.
As a kid, I thought everyone had the same kind of dad that I did. As I got older and my world got bigger, I realized that my dad was truly one of a kind. My family was incredibly blessed to call him ours. He's the kind of man that I hope and pray my son grows up to be, and that my 3 daughters find to share their lives with.
Dad and I spent countless hours together on the baseball field. He was actually my first coach and certainly my biggest fan. He taught me humility in victory as well as sportsmanship in defeat. He coached me till I was about 14 or 15, at which point he stepped aside and joined my mom in the stands. And I always respected that about him. He knew he had taught me all that he could. My favorite baseball memory of him was in high school, my senior year. We were playing in a spring tournament against Atlee, and it wasn't going very well. It was late in the game, and we were down by 4, but the bases were loaded, and I, of course, was up to bat. 3-2 count, and I hit a home run. I hit a grand slam to tie the game up, so I started jogging around the bases, just acting as cool as I can be, just, never doubt, this is what I do. And as I round second base, headed into third, my dad is next to the dugout, and he is absolutely going bananas. I've never seen him that happy. He knocked his hat off. He was jumping up and down. He grabbed the stranger next to him and was like jumping up and down, hugging him, and just absolutely elated. And as I round third base to go home, I totally break my cool. I'm smiling ear to ear just of how happy he was. I wasn't even thinking of the game at that point. I knew he had a memory of a lifetime, and that joy that I saw on his face in that moment is the joy that I envision him with now.
So I never really called Fred Fred. I called him Chief. One day, the Chief and I were in his office in the back of his home in Kings Grant, and it was during that time we talked about everything about the meaning of life, Christianity, God, anything you could imagine. And I found this poem, and I shared it with the Chief, and then he explained to me how, yeah, that's the life of a Christian. And so I took that poem and I put it in a journal that I've kept since that day. It's a poem that's attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it's simply called Success. To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate the beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, check that one off, or a redeemed social condition. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. And Fred and I used to talk about that all the time, and the Chief would be the absolute poster child for that, if you asked my opinion, because I think he checked every one of those boxes.
One thing I can say about Dad with 100% certainty and clarity is how much he loved our mom. He would look at her from across the room and he would light up.
I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, never having spoken a word to her, that she's the one God picked out for me. She's been the absolute best mom in the world. She's been the best wife to me anybody could ever be. Every time we've had ups and downs, especially the downs, we've always been there together.
I just have all kinds of memories through the decades, dressed in, 70s stuff, and mom with her big hair and dad with the beard and dad with the 70s hair. And they just had so much love for each other and joy in being together and doing things together. And I just know that he spent his life with the woman who gave him the greatest joy and filled him in a way that no one else ever would. The last couple of years have been really hard for Dad. As his disease progressed, he forgot more and more things. He didn't really know where home was. He didn't really know who people were. But you could always tell that home was looking at Mom. That was his true home. It fills my heart in such a way to know that she was the last person he saw in this life, and that she's the one that helped him transition to his next life with God. And I don't think it could have happened any other way than the way that it did. And I'm just so glad that she was the person that was able to be there with him, and that she was the last person that he knew on this earth.
Gigi and I were there with him the morning of his passing, and I think we both realized that this was potentially the end. And so I quietly sank to the back of the room as Gigi drew a chair up to his side, prayed, and then I noticed that she reached for her Bible. She chose to read Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. She read that to him quietly, with tears in her eyes, but love in her voice, and the understanding of where Fred was about to go. When she finished, it wasn't but minutes later, he quietly drew back into his pillow and moved to where he deserves to be, and that's in the face of our Savior. But I know that my mother-in-law found the strength to do that in what we can all imagine is one of the most difficult moments in anyone's life. But she did it as her last act of love for the man that she loved her entire life. And I do believe that he took it for what it was meant to be. I just can't be more proud of Gigi.
Dad was so incredibly proud of his 6 grandkids. He just lit up whenever he saw them. He loved hearing stories about them or seeing pictures of them, anything they were up to. It just made his day.
Come get your lemonade, lemonade.
Towards the end, when they would go visit him, he would just be so happy and excited and couldn't wait to get a hug and a kiss, and it just really made his day. While he's no longer here with us, his legacy lives on in all of them. I see it every day. And just the little things they do and the things they say and the expressions they make.
Fred graduated from high school and got accepted in Duke as a civil engineer. While I was going to school, worked full-time.
Went to work for this architect, and what he assigned me to do was to apply the signs to his architectural work. That was my first introduction into signs. I knew nothing about signs. The U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey needed people desperately to keep up with the requirements of the Navy. So I jumped on that opportunity, moved to Norfolk, went through summer training, and then I was stationed aboard a ship, the Explorer.
He went to work for McCleskey Construction Company, designing homes, building homes in the Virginia Beach area. But Fred never could get signs out of his system. Fred dreamed of giving birth to a sign business that did not exist. And out of that came Architectural Graphics Incorporated.
We were living in an apartment, Regency Apartments, my wife and I, and we had just had a baby. When I did this crazy thing, we took a spare bedroom, had a single bed in it, and I put a half sheet of plywood on it. And that was my desk. And that's where AGI had its beginnings.
He was boy wonder. Everything he touched turned to gold. And he had God-given talents that were amazing. And since Fred was the only one that knew anything, he was the estimator, he was the salesman, he was everything. Fred worked unbelievable hours at the beginning of his life. He was amazing at what he could get done. He had a sweet spirit, he loved people, and everyone loved Fred. And from where Fred started it to where it is today, we now have over 1,300 employees. We're $400 and some million in volume with 4 major divisions in the corporation, doing work internationally.
Just a quick funny story about Fred and his brilliance. We had a shed built, Kelly and I, and it was a beautiful shed, and I was excited to show him. So after the shed was built, Gigi and Fred came to visit, and I took Fred out back, and we walked over, and he was looking at the shed and just shaking his head in disapproval. And I was like, Fred, what's the problem? And he just looked at the doors and said, well, those doors are going to be warped very quickly. And I just remember thinking, how the heck can he tell that by just looking at the doors that they're going to be warped? So sure enough, within a few months, we couldn't even close the shed doors anymore because they were so warped. So Fred, you were right.
So let me tell you about Shelby. Shelby was a 12th birthday present to me, but even though she was a gift to me, she was just a family dog. But as the youngest, I was the last one to go off to college, so the dog ended up staying with my parents for quite a while. And then when I came back from college, I moved out to my own apartment. In the apartment, you couldn't have pets, so the dog stayed with my parents. Anyway, about that time, my dad called me one night and he said, hey Kevin, your mom's out of town, want to go grab some dinner? As someone who's just fresh out of college, free dinner, let's go. So I meet him out for dinner, and I could tell something was just a little bit off, and eventually he finally comes out with it and says, the neighbor who was a veterinarian, Bob, came over the other day and checked out Shelby and said that, you know, she's pretty much at the end here, and the best, most humane thing to do at this point is going to be to put her down. So he's going to come over tomorrow and take her and do that. I immediately am just kind of like fighting tears back, and my dad says, Kevin, I've been crying all day, it's okay. So we're both just kind of like crying into our soup, and it was tough. But I obviously go back to the house after dinner to see Shelby, and I take her outside for about 30 minutes, and I just spend some time with her and tell her how awesome of a dog she's been and all that, and you say your final goodbye, and it's tough. Anyway, about 3 weeks later, my parents called me, invited me over for dinner. Again, free dinner, absolutely. So I show up, and who's the first one to greet me in the foyer? There's Shelby sitting right there. I was like, Dad, what's this? He's like, what? I'm like, why is the dog here? And he was just like, oh yeah, I couldn't do it. I was like, what do you mean you couldn't do it? He's just like, that's it, I couldn't do it. I absolutely couldn't do it. And where that was a little emotionally damaging for me, for sure, it just speaks volumes to how caring and compassionate and loving he was.
One thing Dad was incredibly proud of was planning and organizing a trip for 46 people to the Holy Land in 1994. I was lucky enough to be able to go along on this trip, and a couple of the memories that stand out. We all got baptized in the Jordan River, and we were fortunate enough to be there on Easter Sunday, so we got to go to a sunrise service at the Sea of Galilee. We also floated in the Dead Sea, which was pretty cool.
I was really, really lucky because I had the chance to spend the last day and a half with Fred before he passed to heaven. I had the chance to really get to know several of his fellow residents. One in particular, Billy Jack, who was a woman suffering from dementia who really wasn't able to communicate, but could give you a mumble or two. And Billy Jack, the day before Fred passed, was just so committed to visiting Fred. And when we would try to engage her in a chat and ask her how she was doing, we would just get a mumble and, frankly, a little bit of a frown. What I really want to tell you about Billy Jack, though, is what happened the morning that Fred did in fact pass. Within, I believe, minutes of Fred taking his last breath, I noticed in the crack of the door, Billy Jack was standing and leaning her face into the door. But what happened next is hard to describe. I believe it was divine intervention because Billy Jack looked me square in the eye and with absolute perfection said to me, while pointing her finger through the door at Fred in the bed, "He did so much for us." And she then quickly went back to mumbling, and I believe she said, "I go there." And she gently walked down the hall. I don't think that there are 6 better words that could be chosen to really capture the essence of my father-in-law's life. He did so much for us. And if anyone knew him, if only a little, I think you would have to agree.
I met Fred on the baseball field when I was a kid. He was the coach, and at the time, I was in a little bit of a rough spot. My parents had just gotten divorced, and Fred was always a kind and gentle person on the baseball field, and he had a way of making you believe that you could really do anything. It was almost a Jedi mind trick that he could play to get you to have confidence in yourself, maybe when you didn't. And I think that really helped me at that time of my life. My friendship with Kevin continued to grow, and Fred was always present. Oftentimes I would get invited to church and I would have to borrow Kevin's dress clothes because I didn't have any. And Fred would teach me how to tie my tie. I'd even get to go along with their family on vacations to Hilton Head. Now part of that I might have been entertaining Kevin and taking the load off of his parents a little bit, but it also allowed me to see what a successful, hardworking, and dedicated father does to provide for his family. And later on I graduated college and Fred retired from AGI, and our paths crossed again. And I was able to go into business with Fred and Kevin, and through that experience I really got to see what it meant to be very thorough in one's work. He also taught me how to build relationships with clients, and to a degree, how to negotiate, how to know what our self-worth was. Fred didn't look at me with judgment that day on the baseball field. I think he saw a kid that had potential, that maybe just needed a little bit extra help. And I think because of Fred's unselfishness and willingness to try to help those around him, he potentially changed the trajectory of my life. I think that's the definition of what living a wealthy, purposeful life is, and what leaving a positive legacy behind is. And I think Fred embodied that.
The best thing that ever happened to Fred, when he got out of business, a little kid called Kevin was born. And that was the apple of his eye. And he spent his whole life around that boy, playing baseball with him. That was the happiest I've ever seen and the loosest I've ever seen Fred in my entire life.
To my son, Kevin, I could write a book about your accomplishments, sense of humor, and joy you have brought to the whole family. You have been my best buddy, and my memories are all very happy ones of our time together. Your past achievements are more than any dad could have ever hoped for a son. Now it's time for a new season, new challenges, new goals, and new dreams. Continue to grow your faith as you grow your mind. Seek the ways of the Lord first, and all else will be added as blessings. I am so very proud of you. I love you beyond belief. I will always be here for you. Dad. So, how did my dad's story end? I think the answer to that question is simply that it hasn't.